Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's talk about module 7, which is about Glue Workflow. So let's get started. Before I continue on the topic, I want to iterate it one more time that all these topics or modules are interconnected. Their labs are interconnected. So if you want to finish the lab, then you need to start from lab 1, then come to the end, to the last lab. And similarly, if you listen to these topics in the sequence provided, then you can make better sense out of it. So it's advisable that you see all these videos in continuation in order to make maximum benefit out of it. With that, let's move on to the topic. What exactly is Glue Workflow? Glue Workflow is a mechanism, is a method to create a pipeline to orchestrate more than one glue crawlers or glue job. So if we want to execute more than one glue crawlers or glue job, in a certain pattern, in a certain fashion to run a pipeline, then you can use Glue Workflow. Keep this in mind that Glue Workflow can only orchestrate your glue job and glue crawler. They cannot orchestrate any other service. When you run a pipeline using Glue Workflow, then it executes as a single entity. You can monitor the progress of the pipeline at any point of time, and you can also see in what sequence the whole flow is executing. Glue Workflow is serverless. That means you don't need to provision any server, any kind of compute capacity in order to run the Glue Workflow. You can simply configure your Glue Workflow and run it without mentioning any kind of compute capacity to run it. So it's a completely serverless service. So what are the main components of Glue Workflow? Well, Glue Workflow is pretty simple to use, to be very honest, and that's what. And the reason is there are only two components which you need to configure in a certain fashion to make it work. The first component is trigger. Trigger is responsible to start the workflow itself, or a glue crawler, or a glue job. So trigger is the kickstarter of any of these things: workflow itself, or glue job, or a glue crawler. Trigger can start in three methods. It can be started on demand manually, or it can be started based on event, or it can be started based on schedule. Then comes the second component, which is node, and node is responsible to run the job or run the crawler. So keep this in mind. Trigger kickstarts, but actual kickstarts the crawler or job, but actual job or crawler is run by node. Okay, so these are the two components which you can use to configure the workflow, and that makes workflow pretty simple and straightforward, because all you need is these two components, and you can simply configure your whole pipeline for the execution. So let's see how this pipeline configuration might look like. So this is just one example. So you might have, so generally when you're starting a workflow, you start with a trigger, because you need to start your workflow. So to start the workflow, you need a trigger. And this time trigger can start a workflow based on a schedule, or based on an event, or even manually. So the three mechanisms you can use to kickstart your workflow. And then this workflow can call a node, and that node can execute either a crawler or a glue job. And then when that node executes, it can then hand over execution to the trigger again. And at this point of time, trigger is based on the event. So here at this point of time, since you are starting the glue workflow, your trigger could be based on three choices: either a schedule, or an event, or a manual execution. But in the middle of the workflow, trigger has only one choice, that is the event, because this trigger wants to kickstart the next step only when your glue job or workflow has finished the execution. So keep this in mind, that when you're kickstarting a workflow with the trigger, you do have multiple choices like schedule, event, or manual. But when you're using trigger in between, then trigger depends on the event, and that event is primarily telling this this node that this crawler or this glue job has finished the execution. Now trigger, you can kickstart. So this trigger actually, in a simple way, can say it starts based on success or failure of the previous node, and then of course it can start some more jobs or crawler. So that's how the whole execution works. You start with a trigger which starts node can again notify a trigger that it is successful or failed, and based on that, trigger can again start another set of nodes which could again execute certain jobs or crawlers, and so on so forth. You can create your pipeline. Now this looks a very sequential pipeline, but Glue Workflow does provide opportunity to actually do branching out and merging as well. So let's take this example, for instance. So here in this case, what it is saying here, you can see here that I started I'm running this job and crawler or job node in parallel. Or for instance, let's start from here. So here I'm starting based on probably the schedule. So let's suppose this is the beginning of the workflow. I'm starting my trigger based on schedule, and then I said, you know what, when my workflow start, actually I want to run 3 nodes in parallel. So one node can run the job, other can run a crawler, third can run a job again. So these 3 will run in parallel. But then I got a trigger, which is now that I'm using trigger in the middle of the workflow, that means now I have to use trigger based on the event. Now this trigger can actually can be configured in 2 ways. This trigger can be configured for any event. Any event means if any of these events says that, hey, I'm successful, then you start. So it can be configured to wait for any events, that if any of these 3 are done, you can kickstart, or all event. That means when it receives success execution from all the 3 nodes, then only the trigger will kickstart the next job or next crawler, or even parallel execution like you see over here, where it's starting actually 2 things. It's starting a glue job as well as a crawler, both. So keep this thing in mind. When you are configuring trigger in between, then you do have a choice that trigger can wait for any of the previous step to finish and then kickstart the next set of activity, or it can wait for all the previous steps to finish and then start next set of activity. So with this, you can see it's very easy to configure actually branching and merging of your pipeline. You can really create a very complex pipeline using AWS Glue Workflow. Now, when you are creating a Glue workflow, then sometime there is a requirement that there are multiple jobs which are running as a part of your workflow, and those jobs wants to share some state. Like one job wrote some output into some S3 location, and it wants to tell the other job about that S3 location. If you have such a requirements where these jobs needs to communicate with each other and they need to share state with each other, in that case you can use this Glue Workflow properties method, where you can create certain Glue Workflow key value pair kind of properties, and these key value pairs are then accessed by every job within the workflow. And these key value pairs, jobs can actually fetch value from, or can also update the value. So you might have a scenario where you started a Glue workflow, a job started, and when the job finished, it simply updated the property with certain value. Then the second job came, it read that property from the Glue workflow, and then it used that property in some business logic and then updated some other property. So keep this in mind that the jobs participating under Glue workflow can actually access these properties, and they can not only read their properties, they can also update those properties. And by virtue of that, actually workflow properties work like a sharing mechanism, state sharing mechanism between these glue jobs running under the workflow. I have created a very nice video about these workflow and certain hands-on scenario around that in another video. I'm going to provide you description of that workflow description of that video in link of that video in the description box below, and you can use that to learn further about Glue workflow properties. So those were the fundamentals of Glue workflow. As I told you, Glue workflow is not a complex thing. It's a very simple thing to do. It's a very simple mechanism to configure. It's simply used to orchestrate your Glue job and crawlers. So let's do a simple workflow where we are going to orchestrate a Glue crawler and Glue job, and we will see how that configuration can be done in a Glue workflow. So let's jump to AWS Console for that. Here I am in AWS Console. You can see I have logged in as AWS user, which is an administrative account for this AWS account, administrative access to this AWS account. Then I have got Ireland as the region. If you are following me in these labs, please make sure you also use Ireland and the region, so that feature-wise and services-wise, no, there's no issues. So what we are going to do, if I go to my Glue console, I can show you that there is a crawler. There is a crawler called RDS crawler, and this RDS crawler actually catalogs one of the relational database RDS table. So this crawler I am going to use in my workflow as a step number 1, and then I have a Glue job. And that Glue job is actually RDS to S3 Glue job, and these crawlers and Glue jobs actually we created in the previous modules, in the labs of the previous modules. And this job is responsible to read data from RDS and write to S3 bucket. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a workflow which will first run the RDS crawler, and then it will run this particular job as a second step of the workflow, and then we'll see how this two-step workflow can be configured and run. So what is happening is that if I go to tables here, this is the table where I'm going to read data from, and this is the table which is cataloged by the RDS crawler. And this is the table where which we are going to create as an output. So when we call the job I showed you, it creates the employees table. And this job you created in the previous step. And if you are following the sequence workflow, like labs in the sequence, then you know what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to first change all this, whatever we have done so far. Like I'm going to delete the output of my Glue job. And then I'm going to run this crawler and Glue job in a workflow, and then we'll see how this Glue job running under the workflow creates the output for me again. So for that, I'm going to lake formation. So we go to lake formation, we go to tables, and let's have some fun. So let's try to delete this employees table. Before that, I will go to the S3 bucket. So this is the S3 bucket of the table, and so I've created this Dojo Glue Lake bucket, and under that employees table. If you're following me in this lab, that you must have created this bucket with a different name, and so if you see a different name there, that is okay, because that's the name you used, but this is the name I'm using. So first I'm going to simply delete all the files under my employees bucket, because this is the output of the Glue job, and I want to delete it so that when I run the Glue job again as a part of my workflow, I can see that it's creating output again. So I simply deleted the output of the S3 bucket. And then I come to lake formation, and then I try to create this employees table. Delete this employees table. And if I drop that, I should have fun. And that fun is I don't have permission to drop the table. Just because I am administrator here in this AWS account doesn't mean I have access to drop this table because lake formation security works on top of IAM security. So the glue job has created this employees table, but I don't have access to drop this table. But since I am a lake formation admin, I can grant that access to myself. So I can simply select this employees table, go to actions, go to grant, and then I can simply say, okay, fair enough, AWS user, which is me, you do have access to database, employees table, I do have access to drop it. Okay, so I'm simply giving myself, which is AWS user, in this database, Dojo database, employees table, drop permission. So with that, I have got access. So I go back to table again, and if I select this employees table again and simply say I want to drop it, I should not have any problem this now. And you can see the table is dropped. So now I have dropped the table. I have cleaned the output. I have cleared the output over here. So now I'm going to run that RDS crawler, the RDS crawler and that RDS to S3 job in a workflow to create this output again. So for that, I will go to Glue again. I go to Glue. And then I'm going to create a workflow. So I go to the workflows and then say I want to add a workflow, and I will call it say Dojo Lab workflow. Here I can add my workflow properties, but that I'm not using today. So I'll keep everything like that, and I simply say I want to add the workflow. Now the workflow is added, but not the business logic. So I will select the workflow. So it will open up my graph here where I can configure my workflow. So I can simply first add a trigger because I need to start my workflow. So I can start my workflow using a trigger. So I simply click on add my trigger. And I'll call it add a new trigger, which is simply saying start workflow. Okay, trigger. And here you can see I do have a choice to start based on the event bridge event or on demand or schedule. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to run it on demand because for this lab purpose. But in actual production environment, you might want to start this workflow based on certain event or event bridge event or event based on schedule. But I'm going to run it on demand because so that I can run it manually for the lab. So I added my start workflow trigger, and I simply got add node here. So say okay, fine. What do you want to do as a first step? So click on the add node, and my first step is that I want to run a crawl. So all your jobs and crawlers are listed over here, but my first step is I want to run this crawler. So I have got two crawlers, but I want to run this RDS crawler over here. So simply I add RDS crawler. That means it is simply going to first run the RDS crawler. Now, after my RDS crawler finishes the execution, I want to start my glue job, the other glue job which we created in the previous lab. So for that, I'm going to add a trigger. You can add trigger many ways. I can simply go to the action and add trigger over here, or sometimes people simply click on this thing and it will add a trigger for you. So it has simply added a trigger for me. And click on this add trigger. It asks me to configure. I will call this, this will be start next job trigger. And then, and then you can see it is based on the event only. Well, this can also use a event bridge event if you want to hook event bridge event, but I'm going to use the event. And then it says, okay, fine. Which event? I'm like, which of the previous event? And I can go for any and all. So any, if you say that, okay, if any of the previous step finishes, then you start the event, or all you say when all of the previous step finishes, then start the event. In my case, I have got just one previous step. So even any is as good all here. So I can keep it any. Any is equal to all if I have just one previous step. And then it's going to ask me that, okay, fair enough. Then so once you start the any, then what you want to do as a next step? And I simply say next step, I want to actually run a job here, yeah, and add. So you can see over here, it's pretty straightforward thing here. If I can somehow, okay, let's make it bigger, okay. And if I show you the flow, what I'm going to do here, that I'm starting this workflow, which is simply starting the RDS crawler. Then it starts any kind of trigger, which simply start this RDS glue job. So with that, my actually workflow is ready. I can actually go and start this workflow, and when I start this workflow, it will run these RDS crawlers and the glue job in the sequence I have specified and create the output for me. So I can simply go to the actions over here and say I want to run the workflow. And it has start executing the workflow. You can say the status is running now. If I click on this workflow, if I go to history, I can see a workflow execution here. I can click on that execution run ID, and I can see the detail, and it's going to show me the output of the workflow in a output, it's going to show the execution of the workflow in a very dynamic fashion. You can see here it will keep ticking the steps which is finishing as the workflow progresses. So let's wait till the workflow completes, and then we can see, first we can come and see here all the steps being completed, and then we can also, and you can see here it says that my workflow has started, and you can see how it's progressing. And right now my RDS crawler is in progress. So that same way it will keep updating the status of my workflow. So let's wait till this whole workflow finishes, and then we will verify the output after that. So yeah, let's wait. Okay, so you can see the workflow has finished, and you can see all the steps are finished, and they are all ticked off nicely. So my workflow has completed. Now if I go to my tables and I refresh my table, you can see my employees table is back. It has the glue job has created my data at this employees folder, and it has also cataloged that data as employees table over here as configured in the glue job. And if I go to my S3 bucket, this is my S3 bucket. If I refresh this, you can see my data is populated back here as well. So that was example how you can create a workflow to actually run multiple glue jobs as well as crawlers in certain sequence, in certain patterns, to build your ETL pipeline. So that was about the glue workflow, and that finishes this particular module. Now we are going to move to the next module, which is about glue advanced topic, where we are going to talk about some of the advanced glue topic and find out find out how those advanced features or topics you can use to build a great data platform. So see you again in the next module talking about glue advanced topic. Bye bye.